Hello, I'm Jennia D'Lima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. Louis L'Amour's name is recognized even by those who wouldn't call themselves readers, and his many contributions to the literary community are still well loved and much read. Continuing that legacy is his son, Beau L'Amour, and I'm delighted to have him with us on the show today. Well, first, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So, what made you first realize that this was something that you wanted to do? Or did you maybe have a different idea of how to preserve your father's legacy?
Neither one of those things really happened. I had been working a little bit in the publishing business, doing a little bit of work with the art department and in the very early days of audio publishing.
Mm.
And my dad passed away, and I recognized that there were an awful lot of things that needed to be restructured in order to keep us going on into the future. Our business had been all about the new book, it always had been the new
Oh,
book. And I realized that the entire backlist needed to be treated kind of as one unit, and that we needed a publishing program that looked at all of it kind of rather than sort of a scattershot approach. So it kind of grew out of that.
oh, interesting. I just assumed that maybe there was always this inkling of an idea, and then you just sort of launched it from there. So that's much different than what I had in mind. Just, and if you want to tell people very briefly what it is about the book, the volumes.
Having taken over my dad's literary estate and managing that, we've had to do many different things over the years. It's really a good idea if you have a kind of legacy product that occasionally you pull a rabbit or maybe even a rhinoceros out of the hat and show it to the publisher so that they don't, start to take you for granted.
Uh,
And the publisher often has to do exactly the same thing with the booksellers. So over the years, we've done many things. We did a magazine of new Western short stories for a while. We had this very innovative audio publishing program where we did almost all of our work for many years, not so much any longer, but for many years as radio drama, so full cast and sound effects and
oh, wow.
score and everything else. And towards the beginning of this century, there was a moment where the publisher had an awful lot of books in their warehouse that had the wrong price on them. They were wanting to up price. And this was before a lot of these shorter print runs and just in time delivery that has now become a part of the business. And one of the things that we arranged for them to do was to give over 1 million books to the US Armed Forces
Oh my goodness.
as a gift, but hopefully to start readers off.
Hmm.
You have one kid in a tank reading a book, and maybe in the next 10 years you've sold 100 books.
Right.
So I'm always trying to kind of spin the next thing and get it ready to go. And Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures grew out of a problem with a particular bookseller about 10 years ago who was complaining that they had us on their shelves, but there wasn't anything new. We had been publishing books of unpublished short stories
Hmm.
for a while, but that had eventually given out. We got to the end of pretty much everything that my dad had written, and they wanted something new. And the publisher was talking to them about maybe new covers, just something to make it look fresh in
Right.
some manner, to create a better sense of morale amongst the store managers. I've got no idea what exact problem they were facing. And I didn't like that very much. And I just thought new book covers, I mean, we're always involved in doing things like that, but it takes an incredible effort to try and get all the covers sort of looking the same and reflecting
Yes.
similar values and things like that, because we've got 130 plus books.
Right. And then all that back stock that you'd be left with too if you would decide
Exactly.
to, yeah.
Exactly. And they're not going to let us give it away to the military again. So anyway, what happened is we had a website. I had taken a whole bunch of my dad's material and we had created a subscription website. And you could pay a little bit of money if you were a dyed-in-the-wool Louis L'Amour fan, and you could go in there and you could find all kinds of early drafts of books that had been produced, drafts of stories that had never been produced, correspondence, all kinds of stuff. We had this kind of wonderful setup where you could go in there and kind of explore the inside of Louis L'Amour's creative mind. And it had never been particularly popular, especially in those days, pre-social media days. Person went on the web, they did not want to pay for anything. The attitude we ran into all the time was, yeah, I do it, but it's, you want whatever it was, $2.99 a month or something like this.
Right.
And I took that material, I repackaged it into two new books, Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures, Volume 1 and Volume 2. Those would be the unfinished and unpublished short stories or novels, both. And I would take the material that was my dad's material that was there, and I would write a piece about it. After you read it, you'd get to my section, and I would sort of describe why he had written it and what he was hoping to do. And then through possibly notes or journal entries or correspondence, I would say, this is very likely what was going to happen with that particular story. So this is how that story would be finished, would play out. This for the unfinished ones.
Okay.
Some of these stories, there would be multiple drafts. So in the book, if the drafts are interestingly different, I'll give you different drafts so you can see how my dad was playing around with getting the story started. Sometimes there would be a bunch of drafts and I would meld them all into kind of the best of single version. And sometimes there'd be an outline for the book, various things like that. Some of these beginnings of stories are quite long. There's one piece in there that's, I think it's 240 pages. Oh. So it's probably almost all of Act 1 of a relatively big novel. So they go from a couple of pages all the way out to multiple chapters. And so those were in 2 books. And then I wrote with my dad, I finished an unfinished novel of his called No Traveler Returns, which would have been his first novel had he ever published it, and kind of got it set up so that you understood how it fit into his career. So there's a piece in there about what he was trying to do with that novel and when it was. It was written in the late 30s. And then in about 30 plus of the old novels that have been in print for quite a while, I did a postscript, and it did the same thing as I did in Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures Volume 1 and 2. I would try and tell the story behind the story, what he was doing, early drafts. Was there a short story that inspired this? What was he going to try and do with it? Sometimes I'd write a piece on him doing research if I had information about that. Sometimes I'd write a piece on how the movie was eventually made, if that was where there was an interesting story. I just kind of look for whatever was the most interesting thing I could say about that book.
Did you ever have multiple choices for what you would include as postscript material, where you had to pick and choose a little bit?
Not so much, because that's kind of the interesting thing when you have different aspects of something. I could produce one aspect and then I could talk about another aspect. Occasionally there would be several of those things. It wasn't too much of a choice. I mean, I try not to let these things go over 40 pages, and I really don't like them to go less than 6. So, it just kind of depends.
Yeah, it makes sense too to have that parameter in place just to figure out where's the reader going to be comfortable feeling like they have enough bonus material that it counts as bonus material versus when it should be almost this whole separate piece on its own.
It's all different. It's a little hard to say. I mean, each story has a different thing that I'm able to say about it. It's very rarely the least bit repetitive. Like I said, sometimes it would be research, sometimes it would be the fight to get a particular manuscript published, The Walking Drum, a kind of Crusades era adventure story that my dad was only able to publish late in his career, was actually written in 1960. And all the publishers were just saying, no, Louis, we just want Westerns. So there are different trials and tribulations.
That's so fascinating too, because you think about it as just, okay, I'm going to find the best piece that matches this book. I'm going to find this and this, but know that there are so many other variables at play, and that you do have all this other personal information where you're able to make the most informed decision too.
Well, it's in a way that hopefully the casual reader will like
Yeah.
reading. There's definitely a lot of education about the publishing industry. I mean, it's about a guy dealing with the publishing industry from 1953 or even a little bit before to 1988 and
Mhm.
the various adventures that he had there, what was possible, what wasn't possible, and sometimes where various inspirations came from. There's actually kind of a 4-step program in there that deals with my dad's relationship with Katharine Hepburn. They were somewhat distant friends, and she was originally, John Wayne wanted her to play in the movie Hondo, which my dad wrote the story that it was taken from. And she didn't like Wayne because of his political position, so she told him to get lost. And then she and my dad became friends. They explored doing a couple of different stories. None of that came to fruition. But eventually, she became dear friends with John Wayne.
Oh.
And when they made Rooster Cogburn, and they were so happy doing that that they immediately wanted to do a sequel. And the sequel wasn't turning out all that good. It actually was never made. And Katharine Hepburn tried to get my dad in to rewrite the sequel, which he didn't end up doing. But her trying to sort of bring him in and get him to help her out so that she and Wayne could do another movie together.
I love all these little side tidbits because we talk a lot now about how interconnected the creative community as a whole. You know, be talking to someone and you find out they know this musician that you listen to, or they're going to go somewhere and meet this other artist that you're a fan of. And I think this just proves that that's really always been the case. You know, creatives just sort of meld together somehow. It doesn't really matter how you express that
Yeah.
creativity. Yeah, it's just still this like-minded group.
And it was even close, in Hollywood in those days, the bonds were even closer. I used to say that in the days when studios had walls and agents didn't control everybody's career, the community was very, very tight knit.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, going back to the book, I was thinking as you were talking too, how it's that you are giving all these insights into the publishing industry and what it was like for him. You're giving a much fuller picture, not just of your dad, but of author life. And I would say it extends past just author life during that time period, but now because I think it's so easy for readers to just see that book on the shelf or pick it up as an ebook, and they don't really think about everything else going on behind the scenes, or that maybe this author did want to write in a different genre and was told, no, you're not allowed. And they might have those questions like, why doesn't this person branch out? Or why don't they try something new? Or I wish there was another story with this character in it, and not realizing how many roadblocks are in their way to really freely pursuing their own creative dreams that they have.
There are a surprising number of things that hold writers back. And, on the inspiration side, you look at a guy like my dad, he wrote 92 novels and
Mhm.
250 some odd short stories. And you think, oh my gosh, this man was such a productive master that everything he did kind of turned to gold. And it didn't. It's Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures, volumes 1 and 2 are full of all the things he did that didn't work. They are at the same time some of the most interesting material he ever worked on because this was the stuff that was too ambitious for him to
Oh,
finish.
yeah.
So, as an insight into him and his interests, it's really quite amazing.
Hmm.
And I was lucky in writing this material about my father's material and about the publishing industry and things like that. I was lucky that I went to work occasionally, once in a while, in publishing in the 1980s.
Mm,
And
okay.
so I knew a lot of the people also through my dad that had really started the paperback business in the 50s. They were just kind of slightly going out as I started. I had an office when I was working in audio publishing at Bantam Books. I had an office down the hall from Ian Ballantyne, who, I mean, he would tell you that he personally brought the paperback book format to the United States from England. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but he would tell you all kinds of stories about that. And Ian had been around, obviously, forever
Right.
and bent my ear endlessly. Then, even before I was working, I was kind of playing under the desks of Oscar Distel and some of these other guys at Bantam who had gone into that business from magazines. A lot of those guys had been in the OSS during World War II. So there was this kind of camaraderie. There were a bunch of them that had been with the OSS in Cairo during World War II. And so they were kind of buddies from the war and clear through till today. So I certainly haven't seen the business evolve as an adult like my mother has, but I've had a pretty good run.
Yeah, I would say so. So also just not even looking at the industry, but even just looking at your dad's work, how has your view of that maybe evolved? And not just as going from a child to an adult, but perhaps looking at his finished work compared to his unfinished work.
There isn't an awful lot of difference. His novels that he finished, he often wrote in one pass.
Wow.
So there isn't necessarily an awful lot of difference, but oh my God, I've gained so much respect for odd abilities that he had. My dad was a master at knowing what not to write.
Oh, yes.
And I don't mean subject matter. I mean, like literally the difference between what to include in a sentence and what not to include in a
Mhm.
sentence. So many times I'll have fans who will write to me and they'll tell me how beautifully and wondrously he described an area of the country where maybe they live or they visited or something of the sort. And there's not much of a description in the book.
Mm.
My dad was incredible at just giving like just enough details to fire the imagination of the reader and give them a co-authorship
Yes. Oh, I
of
love that. Yes.
of their imaginary experience. I mean, it certainly wasn't just my dad. A lot of guys who graduated from writing short stories to writing the shorter novels that were around in the
Mhm.
50s and 60s, the 180 page, 225 page format that existed in those days. They were very, very good at doing this. And it's a wonderful thing because so many times you'll see in what is supposedly higher grade literature an author telling you everything
Yes. And that leaves no
and
room for the reader.
leaves no room for the reader. I mean, I struggle with this. It's my dad never struggled with it. He kind of knew just how to, eyedropper out the information. And it's a wonderful, wonderful quality.
Oh
I,
no, that is definitely an admirable skill because it's exactly like you said. And I think most people have that tendency because we're almost thinking cinematically and we're trying to get that across in words, but we don't need to do that in words. And again, it almost becomes like a passive experience for the reader because their imagination is no longer activated and engaged because there's nothing for them to really imagine when they're spoon-fed every single detail.
a writer who was writing up until maybe he's still around, I'm not sure, but writing up until a few years ago, who was wonderful at that was Alan First, who wrote a whole bunch of kind of pre-World War II thrillers. And he could put you, a rain damp street in 1938 Paris in like 7 words. I
Yes.
mean, he was incredible, incredible at it.
Yeah, that really is such a gift. And I think it's one of those gifts we don't talk about enough. But especially when you think about the people that did go from short stories first. So they're used to that brevity with their words and knowing how to very judiciously pick each single one so it has that impact and that very limited page space you have. And then just carry over that skill into their longer work.
You will see with my dad and other writers who were masters at certainly popular short stories. Stephen King would be one of them, where sometimes you read their work and you kind of go, there were a lot of these short stories that actually were a better short story than some of the novels were
Yeah.
later. There's just an elegance to the way they do that. And
Hmm.
it's hard to make the difference. Of course, Stephen King went from short stories to gigantic,
Right. A brick.
four inch novels.
Yes.
So maybe it stands out a little bit more. But there are some very good writers who wrote some very good short stories who unfortunately no longer do.
Yeah. So before you were putting all of Lost Treasures together, were you already aware of how much material there would be to work with, or was this a surprise to you?
My dad had a large kind of combination office library, 400 or 500 square feet, with 12-foot tall bookshelves that were on doors that opened up. So there were more bookshelves behind them. And still the room was hip high in books and papers and things. There was a little trail that went over to an area where he could roll his chair around at his typewriter. And then there was a trail that once had led to a couch on the other side of the room. But once the couch disappeared, the trail sort of petered out and there wasn't anything left. And when my dad passed away, it fell upon me to clean up all of that. And one of the last things that we cleaned up were all of these manuscripts. Some of them were broken into sections. Some of them we didn't know what belonged to what. And, we had a whole room stacked full of manuscript pages that we had to reassemble into either books that we knew and we could file away, or things that were mysterious that we were just learning existed. And that's where a lot of that stuff came from.
How long did it take you to sort through everything, and not just sort through it, but put those related pieces together?
I'm still doing it. 30 plus years later. And I will go out to my archive room and a display that's going up at the Reagan Library. And they wanted a couple of pieces of something. And I went out to try and find them. And I was looking through these various sections of notes and realizing that I really should file some of these with the manuscript that they pertain to, that I used them for the lost treasures of that manuscript. And really, I should probably put them both in the same file. So there's still a refinement going on.
Yeah. So how are they currently organized?
The manuscripts are all in fireproof file cabinets in their own files. And so are the finished short stories. And the problem is the notes that made up some of these things. I have several boxes full of notes, and they're all kind of in there at random. We scanned them when we did the website way back in the early days, and we only sorted them out at that point. And so I used that material to create the Lost Treasures books. I didn't go back to the original documents. And so the original documents need some filing. Yeah.
So I was reading on your website, and it was saying that everything is left in its own unfinished form, or most pieces are. So can you explain why you did that and why you decided not to add anything to them, or that you just use the raw material?
Yeah. So you're talking about the unfinished work that's in Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures, volumes 1 and 2.
Yes.
And there have been some things that I've finished. So I finished No Travel Returns, which was this unfinished novel that my dad had. And I also am just finishing a second unfinished novel right now.
Oh,
so I don't know when, how long the publishing business takes to get around to actually distributing a book. So I'm saying this, but a warning to your audience, don't go looking for this book tomorrow. Yeah. But I thought, at least presenting Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures, I thought the fascinating thing was to allow people to find the work like I found it.
Oh, yeah.
And to just experience the mystery of, I did organize it. I did put the notes with the stories, and I did comment on the stories and things like that. And I presented it in an order that was fun to read, not necessarily the order in which it was written or anything like that.
Okay.
But I thought that it would be an interesting thing for a reader to be able to kind of go through the archaeology of Louis L'Amour and uncover these different things at different times, and recognize that, when you get into volume 2, Dad was working on a nonfiction book on a man who traveled all over the Arab world 1,000 years ago, Ibn Battuta. And he tried to sell that nonfiction book to several publishers. Nobody was interested. And then he sat down and wrote kind of a fictionalized version of it, The Walking Drum.
Okay.
So it's not a fictionalized version of a character who is traveling the path of Ibn Battuta or anything like that, but it's definitely inspired from what he learned at that time. And I thought, if you're flipping through this and you start reading this outline for a nonfiction book, and when you get to my section of it, you say, and this became The Walking Drum, that's maybe kind of exciting to sort of explore these things in kind of a random matter and have the experience of discovery.
So for the book that you did finish, what made you decide to finish that piece? And then how did you also seamlessly blend both author voices?
So the easier one to talk about in that way is No Traveler Returns. It's easy also because it's out there and somebody could go buy it right now.
Right?
It was a stack of chapters. Dad started his career writing what we call his Yondering stories, is because we published them in a collection called Yondering back around 1980. And they're kind of Ernest Hemingway-esque sort of personal adventures that were quite realistic, taken from his time traveling around the world in the 1920s. And it actually created kind of a nice career for him. He was published in some very good magazines, and he developed quite a good reputation based on those particular stories. But they didn't make him any money. And so he went on to write for the pulp magazines, kind of pulp adventure and crime stories and things like that. But in the process, while he was doing that, he started work on a novel that was part of that series, that sort of world building event. And it was this No Traveler Returns. It shares a number of characters with Yondering short stories and things like that. But it was really a pile of chapters. Every other chapter in this book is a different crewman on this particular tanker ship that the story follows.
I love all those different perspectives when they're added in.
Yeah, so there's a continuing perspective that keeps appearing in between each one, but then the alternating chapters are different stories, a different background for a different guy, different approach to what's going on, the problems that are happening on the ship, things like that. And they just sort of piled up. They weren't really associated with one another. But as I read it, and it seemed like, I think the story I just finished is a Cold War thriller. So you'd think that would be the easier one to do. But as I was looking through this, I suddenly realized this is one of those all people are connected stories. There was a motif in the work that touched on that. It didn't play it hard, but it touched on it. If you can think back to, there was a whole spate of movies for a while, Vine movies, Lantana and Magnolia. There was Crash was another film that came out back in the 90s that was this kind of mysterious intertwining of lives. I had a friend who made one called Mojave Phone Booth. And I was inspired by that. I went, oh, this story is all people are connected. That's the theme behind this. And on top of it, it's a ship that is taking a cargo to the Philippines and China, afterwards to China. And I just thought, well, whoa, I get it. I know what to do with this.
Yay.
So it needed pieces. It needed a beginning. It needed a better ending. It needed some of the coincidence kind of pulled out of it. It needed the chapters more intertwined with one another. If I have a point of departure from my father's writing and a point that I have to hit, I find it very easy to duplicate his style. It's more difficult if you just kind of have to keep going and going and going and going.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. I was going to ask about that too, because that was something I wondered, how do you do that, or how easy it comes to you?
My dad wrote in 5 different styles. I don't know that somebody else would think so, but I've kind of broken it down that way. And the first 4 from the beginning, from this one that I'm talking about, through his pulp style, through his early paperback original style, kind of his mature paperback original style, and then kind of the later style, I can do the first 4. The later one, where the language got a little more complicated and things like this, I have some trouble with. That would be maybe the last 10 books that he wrote. But the early stuff I find pretty easy. I would say I could not go back into No Traveler Returns and point out where his work stopped and mine started.
Oh, that's impressive.
So it's, I try to do, generally when I'm editing something, now No Traveler Returns was literally the 2 of us as co-writers. But when I'm editing something and I take out a section and I do the same sort of thing, I make a jump like that. I always try to have as little impact as possible. So if I'm going to fix something, I try to do it with a cut first. And if it takes some bridging material, then I try and do the bridging material as minimally as I can. And a lot of times it depends on what I'm bridging. If I'm bridging just a section where I cut it because it needed to be a little shorter, or something like that, that's easy. If I'm making a cut because I've got an inconsistency in a character voice or
Hmm.
something like that, then it's a little more
Yeah,
complicated.
that makes sense. Yeah.
And every once in a while, there's one where it becomes a little difficult. We had a story, By the Waters of San Tadeo, short story, where it was very much this young lady's adventure and kind of getting herself traumatically stuck in a situation down on the coast of South America. And there was kind of a guy that came in at the end that sort of solved everything.
Mm.
And I thought, we've done that one. We've done that one over and over. And we've stuck with this gal for so long. I'd like to see her handle that.
Yeah.
And I know I get letters all the time. People tell me they loved it, but they're like going, that woman was really kind of feral. It's like, it's like she was really tough at the end
Oh
of that,
my
at the end
goodness.
of that thing. I'm like, yeah, I know. I may have overdone it a little bit. And,
Funny.
but that's what it took to have her sort of solve her own problem without this outside influence.
Yeah.
And I try not to let that happen. I don't ever want somebody to pick out,
Oh,
oh, you did
understandable.
this, you
Yes.
did this or something. At the same time, and I'm sure you've experienced this in your business, people really don't understand the impact that editors and publishers have on a manuscript.
Hmm.
And I mean, I will have fans talk to me about how dare you change this comma. And it's kind of like, I'm joking, of course, when I say this,
Right.
but and I mean, I have to kind of politely write back to them and say, if you thought Louis was in charge of commas,
Oh
you're
my
out of
gosh.
your
Yes.
mind.
Yes.
It is not that purely the writer's voice, purely
Hmm.
the perfect thing. We've never had much editing until I came along. In all my work in the publishing business, I've never met an editor that I knew does the kind of work that, say, you do.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So mostly we're going to get like line and copy editing. So development editing, I mean, I saw that once. I had one issue where I realized I was dealing with a development editor on Lost Treasures
Hmm.
because we got in kind of a tiff about a particular thing. I was in the middle of this Louis and Katharine Hepburn story.
Hmm.
And I had said that Katharine Hepburn was too old for a particular role.
Oh.
And the editor got very upset about that. Just like, Katharine Hepburn couldn't possibly have been too old. It's like at the time you're writing about, she was only 28. I was like sitting there going, like, I met Katharine Hepburn a couple of times and she was pretty old by the end of her life. And I'm like going back to 28. I'm like going, was my dad even writing when she was 28? And then I realized she was talking about Audrey Hepburn.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh, yes. That is
And
a very big
the
difference.
weird thing is she had the age exact, but somehow she'd gotten the two women mixed up.
Interesting.
And I mean, she really knew what she was talking about age wise, but she didn't know one actress from the other,
Yes.
which was
Oh,
weird. But I
oh.
was sort of like, we're not talking about the same lady.
This is a great story to leave it on because I
Okay.
think it's hysterical. But yes, so just for our final question, where can people find out more about you and more about these books that you've written? Well, not really written, but compiled.
Compiled and various things. Yeah. So louislamour.com
Mhm.
is a great entry point to everything because on louislamour.com on the top banner, there will be a additional websites thing, which will take you to a
Oh,
website for Louis L'Amour's Lost Treasures and a bunch of other interesting things that we've done that we haven't talked about, but I think somebody would be interested in.
well, thank you again. This has been so amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time talking to you.
Same. And thank you for listening, and be sure to check out the show notes for additional information. And then please join me next week when author Janelle Hovde will discuss why opposing character goals work so well when you're writing romance. Thanks again.